Okay, old sport, the 1920s, and away we go. All right, as we talk about politics in the 1920s, Warren Harding was the nominee in 1920 because the Republicans could not agree on who they wanted, and they knew they could win as there was a backlash against all the problems in 1919, which we talked about. So Warren G. Harding was the compromise candidate because he was a glad hander, he was a backslapper, he was a good times guy, everybody liked him. And of course, he's from what state? Ohio. Harding was not at all fit to be president, but he appointed some big timers, as he had Herbert Hoover as a Secretary of the Interior, Charles Evans Hughes as a Secretary of State, Andrew Mellon as a Secretary of the Treasury. But he also brought the Ohio gang with him. And Harry Doherty is the all-time corrupt, attorney general, right, who got into bed with gangsters and other criminals and eventually had to resign. Albert Fall was in Teapot Dome. He was the Secretary of the Interior that took bribes to secretly lease the nation's strategic oil reserve in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California. He got busted and went to prison for it. But Harding died before he was implicated in any of these scandals. The tariff was raised significantly. The Harding administration did create the Bureau of the Budget, whereas like now the president submits like one budget to Congress rather than doing it piecemeal. Silent Cal became the president after Coolidge died in 1923. Silent Cal, the business of America is business. Very limited government, real strict on spending. The Republicans controlled Congress and the presidency during this whole time period. And when Coolidge won't run in 1929, Herbert Hoover, the Wonder Boy, wins easily, defeating Alfred E. Smith, as there was so much anti-Catholic vote. Smith had support in the cities, but outside of that, even the South, in some spaces, voted for a Republican, Herbert Hoover. This is an era of prosperity while the economy is terrible in 20 and 21. 22 to 28, especially 24 to 28, is a boom. The standard of living rises. You have an expansion of the middle class. However, 40% of the country still lives in poverty. We became incredibly productive as all industries applied scientific management. We learned at great length about how Henry Ford drastically reduced not only the time, but also the cost of producing a car with the assembly line. Union membership declined, 20-25%, as they lost all public support because they are affiliated with radicalism. We talked about the Red Scare. Also, government policies became hostile, court injunctions, the use of police, the use of state militias to break up strikes. Businesses insisted on the open shop where you can't be forced to join a union. Businesses, remember we talked about Henry Ford and welfare capitalism, the sociological department in 1914 with the temporary raise to $5 a day if you played by Henry Ford's rules. Big thing is you had all sorts of new stuff to buy. You had electricity, you had the internal combustion engine, you had cars, you had radios, you had toasters, you had vacuum cleaners, you had refrigerators. And now it's not the railroad that is the most important industry, it is automobiles, rubber, glass, steel, oil, construction, all of the related industries. Here's where I make my Rapper's Delight hotel, motel, Holiday Inn joke, right? It's everything. So many new industries are affiliated with the automobile. Let's see. Okay, let's just kind of keep rolling down. You have a new modern culture which is created, which is vehemently demonized by traditional old America, particularly rural America. They referred to the car as the bordello on wheels. But this is the beginning of the jazz age. This is exclusively Black music, which now we have the beginning of a mass culture, right? As music and programming, sports are disseminated on national networks on the radio or on phonographs. the movie industry starts selling 100 million tickets a week by the end of the decade. And movie stars become the biggest celebrities. As again, we have a shared mass culture, which is dominated by that modern urban culture. Movie theaters were called palaces because they were so big and they were so fancy. Women really challenged the norm this time with flappers, cutting their hair, wearing makeup, smoking in public, drinking in public, and speakeasies. Their dresses go to their knees, not to their ankles. But at the same time, while they openly defied the Victorian idea of what a woman should be, it was still, I'm going to work until I get married and then I'm going to retreat to the home life. You have a huge change in morality. With changing times came changing morals. We talked a lot about this in class when we did Prohibition, about the sexual revolution of the 1920s. Everything seemed to be new and on the table. Of course, Sigmund Freud said that all psychological problems come from sexual repression. I'm sorry if I'm misspeaking there. I have a very vague understanding of Freud, but that's pretty much it. Margaret Sanger continued to advocate birth control, but we're going to learn about this when we get to the 1960s. It's not until 1965, Griswold first Connecticut, that birth control is legal. Every state had still banned it. Americans are getting much more educated, with a quarter of the population graduating from high school now, and this new consumer culture where it kind of masks the idea that people can't afford this stuff, but how are they able to buy it? Credit. 75% of stuff is bought on credit. I cannot remember for the life of me who Frederick Lewis Allen is. If he's on the AP exam, that one's on me. Okay, the Lost Generation. I can't do half the job that Ben Minette would do. Basically, there is a tremendous disillusionment with the materialism of this era. You have people that leave and go to Europe, and the Lost Generation writes about how America is losing its way as it has gotten into this materialistic culture. All of y'all read Gatsby, so we've got that covered. And there is there's new architecture, like the buildings aren't like boring squares. Like think of the Chrysler Building, where's that, Chicago? Like, and how cool buildings look during this time period. You also have art that paints more beautiful pictures of the city. All right, as we talked about issues of race and how bad things were with the race riots of 1919, particularly in Chicago, and then in 1917 there was one in East St. Louis. You've got 1 out of 7 Black people moving from the South to the North, and you have this great expression of Black culture in Harlem, which was the cultural mecca during this time period. Whether it was jazz artists, blues artists, or poets, it was like some things were disillusioned, some things were more celebratory, but it was the taking of this culture very mainstream because of how important Harlem was to the culture of the 1920s. You had Marcus Garvey, who started the Back to Africa movement and the Negro Improvement League, basically preached Black pride and Black nationalism. Unfortunately, he went to jail and then was deported for fraud. But it starts a movement that we'll see you just saw a resurgence of Malcolm X, right? And some of the more militants in the 1960s. There becomes a real conflict over the morality of America, in that this new urban culture, this youth culture that, remember, they were not wearing short dresses. My man, J.C. Coley from down in Alabama, that girl came back from Chicago. We're doing that. We're smoking, drinking, loose with talk. This sifted down from the cities. Yeah. And so, there is a massive defensive and a huge, evangelical Protestant revival. And what's different, like the big thing is now, you're not getting 25,000 people, and not Camp Hill, Kentucky. Where is it? What's the place in Kentucky in 1810 where they had the big revival? Camp something. Come on. Sorry, I lost that one. That better not be on the test. But now you're not having the camp meeting out in the sticks. Billy Sunday, right? We saw him. He gave his famous speech, Booze, right? Where he talks about all social problems are due to alcohol. Amy Semple McPherson in her Foursquare Church in Los Angeles was packing in 4,500 people for a service and doing sometimes 4 a day. And remember, the Scopes trial, most southern states had outlawed the teaching revolution. The ACLU got John Scopes to teach it. And now religion's going to be put on trial in Dayton County, Tennessee in 1925, right? And, remember, like Sonny Robinson, right? All of our friends from the century, there was a lot of hoopla, right? And our other guy, right? Giles Ryan, right? It was like, there's so many newspaper people, you couldn't start with a stick, right? Everybody went down to Dayton. And as historian Jeffrey Perez said, the Scopes trial became emblematic, right? Am I going to favor science, or am I going to favor religion? And Scopes was guilty. Everybody knew he was going to be guilty. But you have the most famous defense attorney, Clarence Darrow, and 3-time loser for president of the United States, William Jennings Bryan, a self-proclaimed expert on the Bible, who actually testified at the trial on being an expert on the Bible. And Darrow puts him on the stand and tries to shake him and says, "How can you tell me the world was created in 6 days?" And Darrow says, "That's days for God, not for man." And believing that Jonah went into the belly of the whale. And the northern newspapers that were very pro-modernist painted it as a huge victory for Darrow for discrediting fundamentalism, but nevertheless, it remained extremely popular. All right. The ultimate triumph of conservative rural culture was prohibition. And the Volstead Act was able to enforce the 18th Amendment. It criminalized the manufacture, transportation, or sale of alcohol, but that of course led to a huge boom in organized crime. People like Al Capone, remember we talked about how crime became syndicated, where you had the 5 families of New York and New Jersey, and we think of that as the mafia, but it's those 5 families working with Al Capone in Chicago, and working with Sullivan in Boston, right? And whether it is Los Angeles, Kansas City, Pittsburgh, right? And crime really became a syndicate, and it became coordinated. And that was part of the reason, in addition to the need for revenue during the Great Depression, that finally led the great social experiment, the Noble experiment, to be repealed with the 21st Amendment. As we had talked about, immigration shuts off during World War I, but there's 1 million people that come in 1919 and again in 1920. And there is people want no affiliation with Europe. There is a feeling that immigrants are poor. They're coming from these Eastern European countries. They could easily become radicalized if they're not radicals already. And as the country was in a really bad economic spot trying to transition, the old argument that it was labor competition led to the quotas of 1921 and 1924. The quota of 1921 said 3% can come in based on the 1910 census. The law of 1924, I think that's the Johnson-Reed Act. I think 1921 is called the Emergency Quota Act. I think in 1924 it's called the Johnson-Reed Act, and that's at 2% of the population of 1890. Basically eliminating immigration from Southern, Central, Eastern Europe. From Japan, it's banned altogether, and it's extremely limited from what we still have the Chinese Exclusion Act. It did not impact Mexico and Canada. We talked about the huge spike of the Klan. 5 million people joined the Klan by 1925. Fortunately, it had a meteoric fall, just like it had a rise. When, what is his name, Stevenson, the head of the Klan, is convicted of murder. But we did still see in 1927, 50,000 Klansmen march down Pennsylvania Avenue. It's still anti-Black, but it's also anti-Catholic, anti-foreign, anti-Jew, anti-communist. We talked about Birth of a Nation and how that portrayed the Klan as saviors of traditional Christian values. And certainly that reflected this cultural conflict during this time. It's not just in the South, it's huge in the Midwest. Indiana had more Klansmen than any other state. Remember, this is a time where isolation is a myth. Yes, we don't join the League of Nations, but we lead the charge with worldwide disarmament, particularly with navies, as we get the major powers to agree to drastically reduce the size of their navies and respect each other's territories in the Pacific, hence the Nine-Power China Treaty. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, Frank Kellogg and Amistad Briand got signatories to promise not to go to war, but only as defensive measures, and there were no, it was idealistic. There were no punishments if you violated it. Latin American policy. What did I want to point out here? We continue to have problems in Mexico, but we are able to, when the new Mexican government says they're going to nationalize everything, they don't nationalize American businesses, and we continue to send troops in under the Roosevelt Corollary to a whole slew of other Latin American countries. We insist that war debts are repaid, even though only one country repaid their debts, Finland, right? And France and Great Britain are like, we just got our teeth kicked in for democracy and you can't cut us a break. And we said, no. What is the famous Calvin Coolidge quip? They hired the money, but you can't get blood from a stone. And the Germans can't pay back the massive reparations to the British and the French. The British and the French can't pay the Americans. So the Dawes Plan, what is that? Secretary of State Dawes negotiates where not the United States, but American bankers, private banks, loan money to Germany, because Germany is in total economic disarray. Remember, like, took the wheelbarrow of Marx to buy a loaf of bread. The Dawes Plan was private American banks loan money to Germany. Germany pays back its war reparations. Then there's war reparations from Britain and France get paid back to the United States to repay war loans. It's called that circular flow. We're good. All right, on to the Depression next.